The smell hit me before I reached the dining room. Salt, iron, expensive perfume trying and failing to cover both. I stood in the marble foyer of Harborview Country Club with a dull ache sitting across my shoulders like a loaded rucksack. 14 months of rebuilding deep water supply ports across Southeast Asia had a way of settling into your joints. Even after a week back stateside, my body still expected steel decks under my boots and construction reports waiting on my desk before sunrise. Instead, I was staring at a crystal chandelier the size of a fishing boat. My dress uniform was pressed so sharply it could have cut paper. The ribbons were straight, the brass shined. Everything looked exactly the way Army regulations demanded. My hands ruined the picture. No amount of polish could hide the rough skin around my palms or the thin white scars crossing my fingers. A steel cable doesn't care what rank you are when it snaps, neither does rebar. A valet glanced at my uniform, then at my hands. His eyes paused for half a second, long enough. I gave him a nod and walked past. The sound of laughter drifted from the dining room. Not the relaxed kind, the performance kind. The kind people use when they want everyone else to know they're having a wonderful time. My mother loved that kind of laughter. 3 days earlier, Loretta had called me while I was reviewing flood mitigation reports for a coastal project in Virginia. "You will be there, Wren. Not hello. Not how are you. Just an order. I'm working. You can take one evening off." I flew across the Pacific for 14 months. I'm already taking evenings off. Silence. Then her favorite weapon. This is a mandatory family milestone. Nobody ever knows what that phrase means. It usually means someone wants an audience. I should have trusted my instincts and stayed home. Instead, I walked into the dining room. The room looked like a real estate brochure had come to life. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor. White tablecloths covered every table. Crystal glasses reflected light across polished hardwood floors. Every conversation seemed to involve investments, development projects, or somebody's second vacation property. A waiter passed carrying a tray of champagne. I grabbed sparkling water, old habit. You spend enough years around construction sites, and you learn quickly that clear decisions are more valuable than expensive drinks. At the center of the room stood my mother. Of course. Loretta Alder never entered a room, she occupied it. She was adjusting a diamond necklace around my younger sister's neck while 3 women watched with admiration that looked suspiciously rehearsed. Giselle smiled as if she'd personally cured a disease. The necklace probably cost more than my first pickup truck. Not that she'd paid for it. Giselle never paid for things if she could convince someone else to do it. My sister spotted me first. There she is. Several heads turned. The smile on her face tightened slightly when she saw the uniform. I knew that look. The uniform didn't fit tonight's aesthetic, neither did I. "Wren," she said, stepping forward carefully so nobody missed her necklace. "You made it." She laughed. I wasn't joking. Before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Smooth, polished, the verbal equivalent of a luxury car commercial. Captain Alder. Von Beck extended his hand. His suit probably cost $4,000. His watch probably cost $20. His smile looked leased. Shook his hand anyway. His grip lasted half a second longer than necessary. A small dominance game. People like Vaughn always played those. "Good to see you," he said. "You too, it wasn't." He studied my uniform for a moment. Still saving the world? Mostly repairing things people break. A few nearby guests chuckled. Vaughn's smile stayed in place. The joke had landed. Just not where he wanted. My mother appeared beside us before the silence could grow. "Wren, try to enjoy yourself tonight." "I am." "No, you're observing." "Same thing." Loretta sighed dramatically. She'd spent 34 years wishing I'd become a different person. I had spent 34 years disappointing her. The relationship was remarkably efficient. A waiter approached with another tray. Champagne this time. Everyone took a glass except me. Again. My mother's eyes followed the sparkling water in my hand. Another disappointment added to the collection. Across the room, investors clustered around Vaughn like moths around a porch light. That made sense. Tonight was his victory lap. For weeks, I'd heard endless conversations about a coastal property deal. A huge opportunity, a transformational investment, a once-in-a-generation acquisition. People in real estate always describe deals the way fishermen describe fish. The stories get bigger every time they're told. I already knew which property everyone was celebrating. Abram Finch's old shipping yard, 40 acres of rusting infrastructure, abandoned warehouses, damaged docks, and waterfront access. Most people saw junk, developers saw future condominiums, politicians saw tax revenue, investors saw profit. Abram had seen something else entirely. The old engineer had spent decades studying every inch of that coastline. Nothing he did was accidental. Nothing. The thought of Abram made me glance toward the harbor outside. I could almost hear him laughing. Not loudly, just enough to let you know he'd already solved a problem everyone else was still arguing about. Back inside, Vaughn raised his champagne glass. The room gradually quieted. Conversation slowed. People turned toward him, toward my mother, toward Giselle, toward the celebration. A spotlight without an actual spotlight. Vaughn wrapped an arm around my sister's waist. Loretta beamed with pride. Investors smiled. Politicians nodded. Everyone looked certain they were witnessing the beginning of something enormous. Maybe they were. Just not the thing they thought. I took a slow sip of water and watched the room settle into place. Every person seemed convinced they understood exactly where value lived, who mattered, who didn't, what was worth keeping, what was worth throwing away. And sitting there beneath those chandeliers, surrounded by people congratulating themselves for buying a future they hadn't bothered to understand, I found myself paying much closer attention to what wasn't being said than to what was. Have you ever watched someone celebrate a victory that you knew was built on a mistake? Let me know in the comments. New stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. If you enjoy thoughtful family dramas with real lessons and unforgettable twists, make this channel part of your daily routine. I'll see you at the next premiere. I set my glass down and watched another investor shake Vaughn's hand. The line was getting longer. Apparently, buying 40 acres of rust and weeds made you a visionary these days. Vaughn seemed to enjoy every second of it. He moved through the room like a man accepting an award nobody else had qualified to win. Every laugh came a little too quickly. Every story got a little bigger each time he told it. I had met dozens of men like him near ports and construction zones. The expensive version was always easier to spot. A waiter slid a chair out near the end of the table. I took the seat without announcing myself. Nobody noticed. That wasn't unusual. Being overlooked had practically become a family tradition. Across from me, Giselle was explaining wedding plans to a group of women who seemed fascinated by linen colors and imported flowers. "I don't want ordinary ivory," she said. "I want European ivory." One woman nodded seriously, as if ivory had a passport. I took a sip of water. 3 seats away, my mother was busy retelling the story of Vaughn's land purchase for what felt like the 10th time. "The timing was just perfect," Loretta said proudly. "Abram Finch leaves the property to our family, and Vaughn immediately sees its potential. Potential. That word was doing a lot of work tonight. Nobody mentioned that Abram Finch had spent most of his life refusing offers on that property. Nobody mentioned that the developer had been circling those docks for years. Nobody seemed curious why an engineer as careful as Abram had held on to that land until the day he died. Those details were inconvenient. People rarely investigate miracles they want to believe in. A burst of laughter pulled my attention back toward the center of the table. My mother had started telling one of her favorite stories. Unfortunately, I was in it. "Ren was always different," she said. Several guests smiled politely. That sentence never ended well. While Giselle was taking piano lessons and preparing for college events, Ren spent her weekends covered in dirt helping Abram fix broken equipment. A few people chuckled. Loretta smiled. Honestly, there were days I thought she'd grow up and become a mechanic. More laughter. I looked down at the condensation on my glass. The funny part was that a good mechanic probably understood more about how the world worked than half the room combined. But that wasn't a popular opinion at country clubs. Giselle joined in. "Remember when she rebuilt that old forklift engine?" "Oh, I remember," Loretta said. "I was 14, I said. My mother waved a dismissive hand. Exactly what?" Nobody knew. The room laughed anyway. People tend to follow the crowd when they aren't sure where the joke is. A man sitting nearby leaned toward me. "What branch did you say you were in?" "Army Corps of Engineers." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, that was all. Just, oh." I'd heard that response hundreds of times. People imagined military engineers spending their days moving dirt around. They never imagined logistics networks, port reconstruction, flood control systems, dam inspections, navigation channels, or billion-dollar infrastructure projects. Frankly, that misunderstanding had become useful. People reveal a lot when they underestimate you. Across the table, Vaughn finally turned his attention toward me. Bad sign. His smile widened. Worse sign. Good to see you taking a break from the mud, Ren. Several heads turned. The performance had started. I gave a small nod. Good to be here. Maybe with the family's new money, we can buy you out of your contract. The room laughed. A few people nearly spilled champagne. Apparently, the idea of a military officer being rescued by wealthy relatives was comedy gold. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I picked up my glass, took a sip, set it back down. The silence lasted just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Vaughn filled it himself. Come on, you don't have to spend your life rebuilding docks. I looked at him. I like docks. A woman near the end of the table snorted into her drink. The first genuine laugh I'd heard all evening. Vaughn smiled politely, but I could tell the response hadn't gone according to plan. People like him preferred targets that reacted. I wasn't reacting, I was a big difference. You know what I mean, he said. Probably. Another pause, he shifted slightly in his chair. Tiny movement, easy to miss. The thing about construction sites is that they teach you to notice pressure points. A crack doesn't suddenly appear. It announces itself long before anyone else sees it. Conversations worked the same way. Vaughn wanted admiration, not dialogue. The room wanted a success story, not facts. My mother wanted validation, not questions, and tonight all three had aligned perfectly. Loretta lifted her champagne glass. To family. Everyone echoed the toast. To family. Glass touched glass. Smiles filled the room. Meanwhile, all I could think about was Abram Finch. I remembered standing beside him years earlier on those same shipping yards everyone suddenly wanted. The docks had been rusted even then. The warehouses looked ancient. Seagulls had claimed half the structures. But Abram never talked about appearances. He talked about access, depth, permits, infrastructure, shipping corridors, things investors rarely photographed for brochures, things engineers never ignored. The old man used to carry a small notebook in his shirt pocket. Every measurement mattered, every detail mattered, every assumption got checked twice. That was why tonight felt strange. Not because people were celebrating. People celebrate bad decisions every day. What felt strange was believing Abram Finch had left behind something as simple as a piece of land. Nothing about Abram had ever been simple. I glanced toward the harbor beyond the windows. The lights from several commercial vessels blinked in the distance. Cargo ships, working ships. Ships that generated revenue every hour they moved. The sight reminded me of something Abram once said while reviewing harbor traffic charts. The most valuable thing on a waterfront property usually isn't sitting on top of the ground. At the time, I thought he was talking about foundations. Years later, I wasn't so sure. Back inside, another round of congratulations swept through the room. Vaughn raised his glass again. Giselle smiled for photographs. My mother looked happier than I'd seen her in years. And sitting quietly at the edge of the table, I watched people who had never built anything celebrate the destruction of something they didn't understand. I kept my eyes on the harbor lights while another round of laughter rolled through the room. Then a spoon struck crystal. Once, twice. The sound cut through every conversation. My mother had risen from her chair. The room quieted immediately. People who ignored construction workers all day suddenly became very attentive when someone in designer jewelry wanted to make a speech. Loretta smiled at the crowd. Not a relaxed smile, a prepared one. The kind that had probably been rehearsed in a mirror. Thank you all for being here tonight. Several guests nodded. A few lifted their glasses. My mother placed one hand over her chest. I can't tell you how much this evening means to our family. There it was, the performance. She spoke about legacy. She spoke about opportunity. She spoke about how blessed everyone felt. She mentioned family 5 times in less than 2 minutes. I counted, old habit, engineers count things. Then she shifted toward Abram Finch. A brief silence settled over the room. Of course, she continued, lowering her voice slightly. None of this would have been possible without the generosity of our dear friend Abram. A few people murmured agreement. Most of them barely knew the man. Abram never cared much for country clubs. His preferred social circle usually involved welders, tugboat captains, harbor inspectors, and anyone who knew the difference between maintenance and decoration. My mother dabbed the corner of one eye with a napkin. No tears, just the gesture. Then she smiled again, and suddenly I knew something was coming. I recognized that smile. It always appeared right before she embarrassed somebody, usually me. Abram didn't just leave our family the estate. The room leaned in. He left a special envelope for Ren. Several heads turned toward me. I remained seated. Across the table, Giselle looked far too excited. Not a good sign. Since she spent so much time in his dusty old workshop, my mother continued, we thought it would only be fair if she opened it tonight. A few people chuckled politely. The phrase dusty old workshop earned exactly the reaction she wanted. Loretta reached into her handbag, designer logo. Probably cost more than the transmission replacement on my truck. She pulled out a battered manila envelope. The thing looked ancient. Yellowed corners, fold marks, years of wear. My attention immediately landed on the seal, already broken. Interesting. They had opened it before I arrived. Of course they had. My mother slid it across the white tablecloth. The envelope stopped directly in front of me. Go ahead, Giselle said, her grin widened. Show everyone your inheritance. A few people laughed, others watched with open curiosity. The room suddenly felt smaller, not because of pressure, because of focus. Every eye had landed in the same place. The envelope. I picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it looked. Abram always bought quality materials. Even his notebooks weighed more than most people's paperwork. I turned the envelope over once. No writing, no label, no explanation, just age. Across the table, Vaughn leaned back comfortably. He looked like a man already confident in the outcome. I opened the flap, tilted the envelope. Something metallic slid forward first. Clank. A heavy iron key landed on the table. Several people frowned, then a folded sheet of yellow drafting paper followed. Nothing else, no letter, no stock certificate, no deed, no check, no explanation. Just a rusted key and a blank piece of paper. The room waited. Silence lingered for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Then Vaughn laughed. Not the polite social laugh he'd been using all evening. A real one, sharp, unexpected, completely genuine. A piece of trash and a blank page. More laughter followed immediately. The room relaxed. The mystery had apparently been solved. Vaughn shook his head. I guess the old man knew exactly what your career was worth. The table erupted. A few guests nearly choked on their drinks. One investor slapped the table. Someone muttered, "That's brutal." My mother sighed dramatically. The sound carried just enough pity to reach nearby tables. Well, she said softly, at least you have a souvenir, Ren. More laughter. Giselle covered her mouth, not to hide embarrassment, to hide amusement. I looked down at the objects sitting in front of me, the key, the paper. The laughter continued. Nobody noticed I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the key, specifically the bow. Abram marked everything. Tools, storage crates, dock equipment. Nothing escaped labeling. Sure enough, there it was, a serial number. Stamped deeply into the metal, partially worn. Still readable. Interesting, very interesting. The laughter around me kept going. People always miss details when they're busy enjoying themselves. I unfolded the paper, slowly. The drafting sheet opened cleanly despite its age. Yellow, blank. At least that's what everyone else saw. Vaughn leaned forward. What does it say? I didn't answer, because technically it said nothing. The surface appeared empty, no words, no drawings, no signature, nothing. Someone at the far end of the table laughed again. Maybe it's symbolic. Another guest added, maybe Abram wanted her to write her future. That earned more laughter. Apparently motivational humor was popular among real estate investors. I let them enjoy it. The paper remained in my hands. The texture felt familiar, extremely familiar. Years earlier, Abram had taught me how to review archived harbor maps. Some documents contained hidden seals, hidden stamps, watermarks, security marks invisible under normal conditions. Most people never noticed them. Most people weren't supposed to. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Abram, standing beside a drafting table, oil stains on his sleeves, reading glasses sliding down his nose. Anybody can read what's printed on paper, Ren. He had tapped a document. The important information is usually hiding somewhere else. Back in the present, another wave of laughter rolled across the room. I barely heard it, because something about the edge of the paper had caught my attention. A tiny raised impression. Almost invisible, almost. My thumb moved across the corner, then across the center. There it was again. A pressure mark. Not ink, not damage. An impression. Very deliberate, very precise. Abram Finch had spent 81 years solving logistical problems that other people couldn't even identify. The odds of him leaving behind a meaningless blank sheet of paper were approximately 0. Across the table, Vaughn was still smiling. My mother looked satisfied. Giselle looked entertained. The audience believed the joke had ended. I wasn't so sure. I folded the paper carefully, set it beside the key. And for the first time that entire evening, I became genuinely interested in what Abram had left behind. I slid my thumb across the edge of the paper one more time. The raised impression was still there. Tiny, precise, deliberate. Around me, the laughter was beginning to fade as people returned to their meals and conversations. The entertainment portion of the evening had apparently concluded. The strange military daughter had received a rusty key and a blank piece of paper. Everyone had enjoyed the punchline, case closed, except it wasn't. A woman near the center of the table leaned toward my mother. Is that really all Abram left her? Loretta laughed softly. As far as we know. As far as we know. Interesting choice of words. Because my mother wasn't curious, neither was Giselle. They had already decided what the envelope meant before I walked through the door. Worthless. Just like the old docks. Just like Abram's workshop. Just like most of the things they didn't understand. I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the key. Then I looked up. My mother was smiling again. Vaughn was halfway through another story about future waterfront condominiums. Giselle was showing engagement photos to people she had met less than 30 minutes earlier. Nobody looked worried. Nobody looked suspicious. Nobody looked interested in the contents of the envelope anymore. That told me everything. 10 years in the Army Corps of Engineers teaches you something valuable. Panic is a waste of oxygen. When a retaining wall fails, you don't stand there screaming at concrete. You inspect the failure point. When a bridge develops structural movement, you don't argue with gravity. You check the calculations. Problems are solved by information, not emotion. I looked down at the key. Heavy iron. Old manufacturing style, not decorative. Functional. The grooves weren't random. Neither was the serial number. Abram had spent his entire life around ports, warehouses, shipping authorities, and industrial infrastructure. People like him didn't carry ornamental keys. Everything served a purpose. I rotated the key slowly under the chandelier light. The metal reflected dull orange highlights, years of oxidation, years of use. Then I noticed something else, the wear pattern. The teeth showed repeated use despite the rust. Not recent use, historical use. Whatever lock this key belonged to had been opened many times. That mattered. Across the room, another toast went up. Someone was celebrating projected profits. Projected. My favorite word in development presentations. Projected revenue, projected growth, projected occupancy, projected demand. Nobody ever framed a presentation around projected mistakes. I looked back at the paper, still blank, still ordinary, still wrong. My fingers moved across the edge again. There, the dry stamp impression, nearly invisible. Abram had shown me examples years ago. Federal permits, maritime filings, port authority records, corporate registration documents. Certain seals were designed to be felt before they were seen. That wasn't common knowledge. Most people never handled original documents. They handled copies. Copies hide things. Originals reveal them. A memory surfaced. Abram sitting across from me inside his workshop while rain hammered against the metal roof. I had been 19. He'd been explaining why certain harbor permits remained valid for decades. Most people only look at what's obvious. He handed me a document. What do you see? A map. What else? I stared at it. Nothing. Then he held it toward a lamp. The hidden seal appeared instantly. I remember laughing. Abram didn't. He simply nodded. Most fortunes survive because impatient people stop looking too soon. Back in the country club, Vaughn's voice pulled me back into the present. 320 residential units. Several investors nodded approvingly. He continued. Private marina, access. More nodding. Luxury retail. Even more nodding. The numbers sounded impressive. Unfortunately, numbers only matter when they're attached to reality. I already knew enough about coastal development to recognize several assumptions hidden inside his projections. Assumptions can be expensive, particularly when federal regulations become involved. My attention returned to the envelope. Something else bothered me, the broken seal. They had opened it before I arrived. That meant they had examined the contents. Or at least they believed they had. Which raised another question. If they truly thought the contents were worthless, why save the envelope at all? Why bring it tonight? Why turn it into a public spectacle? The answer was simple. Humiliation. The envelope wasn't presented because it lacked value. It was presented because they believed I lacked value. The envelope was just the delivery system. That realization should have hurt. Strangely, it didn't. Maybe because it wasn't new. When you're the family blind spot long enough, eventually you stop expecting people to notice where they're looking. Across the table, my mother caught me examining the key. Still trying to figure it out? Several people smiled. I smiled back. Just looking. Loretta shook her head. Sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be. I almost laughed. If there was one lesson Abram Finch had spent 20 years teaching me, it was the exact opposite. Things are almost never what they appear to be, particularly around water, particularly around property, particularly around money. I looked at Vaughn. He was relaxed, comfortable, confident. The confidence wasn't fake. That was the interesting part. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed the land belonged to him. He believed the future belonged to him. Most importantly, he believed he understood the asset he had purchased. Abram would have loved that. Not because he disliked Vaughn. Abram rarely disliked people. He simply enjoyed watching arrogance collide with reality. The old engineer had spent 80 years studying systems, ports, shipping routes, property structures, government contracts, corporate ownership frameworks. He understood something most people never learn. The biggest trap isn't hidden information. The biggest trap is believing you already know everything. I sat perfectly still. The noise of the room drifted around me. Silverware, laughter, glasses touching, investment conversations, wedding plans, future condo discussions. Meanwhile, an entirely different conversation was unfolding inside my head. The serial number, the dry stamp impression, the broken seal, the timing, the property, Abram's history, the pieces were beginning to align. Not completely, not yet. But enough. Enough to understand one thing with absolute certainty. Abram Finch had not accidentally left me a rusty key and a blank sheet of paper. And judging by how comfortable everyone else looked, none of them had the slightest idea what he had actually done. I slipped the key back onto the table and let my hand rest beside it. The pieces were starting to fit together. Not enough to see the entire picture. Enough to recognize the frame. Across the room, conversations had returned to normal. The envelope had already become old news. Investors were discussing future returns. Wedding plans had regained their place as the evening's favorite topic. Someone was explaining yacht club membership fees to a city councilman. Meanwhile, Vaughn was enjoying himself. A little too much. He leaned back in his chair and swirled the bourbon in his glass. The ice cubes clicked softly against the crystal. He caught me looking toward the harbor. Don't feel too bad, Ren. Several people nearby immediately paid attention. Vaughn loved an audience. When I bulldoze those ugly docks next week, I'll save you a brick. A few guests laughed. He pointed toward me with his glass. You can put it on your desk at whatever army base you're assigned to. More laughter. Not as loud as before. Still enough. I looked up at him, my voice stayed flat. You're pouring concrete next week? Absolutely. His grin widened. We own the dirt now. The phrase landed harder than he intended. Own the dirt. Interesting. The permits are a formality. Several investors nodded. That statement earned approval because it sounded confident. Unfortunately, confidence and accuracy rarely travel together. I tilted my head slightly. Did you run the environmental clearances on the subsoil? The smile remained on Vaughn's face. Barely. Of course. Did you check the maritime easements? The smile weakened. Not much. Just enough most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. He took a sip of bourbon. Everything's under control. Not an answer. A response. Different thing. I waited. Silence is useful. People rush to fill it. Sure enough, Vaughn continued. It's a waterfront lot. He waved a dismissive hand. I bought the ground. I own the access. That's how real estate works. Several people nodded again. The confidence returned. Then he delivered the final line. But I wouldn't expect a soldier to understand high-level finance. The table laughed. My mother smiled. Giselle nearly spit out her champagne. And just like that, Vaughn made the single biggest mistake of the evening. Not because he insulted me. I've survived mortar attacks, typhoons, collapsed piers, congressional audits, and army procurement meetings. An insult from a real estate developer wasn't exactly life-changing. The mistake was something else. He answered the question. Without realizing it, I picked up my glass, took a sip, set it down, no response. No argument, nothing. That confused him more than any comeback could have. People like Vaughn prepare for resistance. Agreement makes them nervous. Across the table, one of the investors leaned forward. What are maritime easements? Good question. Vaughn answered before I could. Old legal paperwork. The investor nodded, apparently satisfied. I wasn't, because that answer was spectacularly wrong. A maritime easement isn't old paperwork, it's control. sometimes millions of dollars worth of control, sometimes much more. I remembered standing beside Abram years ago while a shipping company representative toured part of the property. The man kept asking questions about acreage. Abram kept talking about access. The representative eventually got frustrated. "Why do you keep ignoring the land value?" Abram smiled. "Because the water is paying the bills." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I did. More importantly, I was beginning to understand why Abram had never sold. Across the table, Vaughn had already moved on. He was describing future marina facilities, luxury retail spaces, private waterfront restaurants, premium residential towers. The numbers kept growing. Every version sounded more expensive than the last. I listened carefully, not because I believed any of it, because I wanted to hear his assumptions. Developers rarely fail because they lack confidence. They fail because they build entire financial models on assumptions nobody verifies. One statement caught my attention. "We'll start removing the old dock structures immediately." Interesting. Very interesting. Another investor nodded. "Any environmental concerns?" Vaughn laughed. "Nothing major." My eyes stayed on him. Nothing major. The old shipping yard had operated for decades. Industrial operations, marine equipment, fuel storage, maintenance facilities, repair zones, historical runoff. Any competent environmental review would spend months examining that site. Months. Not days. Certainly not 1 week. I glanced toward my mother. Loretta looked completely relaxed. She had no idea a conversation was actually taking place. To her, tonight was about money. To Vaughn, it was about profit. To Giselle, it was about status. To me, it had become something else, information. The room continued talking around me. Forks clinked against plates, servers refilled drinks. Someone near the far wall began discussing interest rates, normal sounds, normal conversations. Yet the more Vaughn spoke, the more obvious the problem became. He understood the purchase price. He understood projected revenue. He understood investor presentations. What he didn't understand was infrastructure. Ports aren't shopping centers. Shipping corridors aren't parking lots. Maritime rights aren't decorative legal language buried inside paperwork. And water doesn't care about business plans. Abram understood all of that, probably better than anyone on the coast. Which brought me back to the key, and the paper, and the hidden seal, and the broken envelope. The old engineer hadn't spent decades protecting that property just to leave behind a random joke. No chance. Across the table, Vaughn finished another story and raised his glass. The investors applauded. My mother beamed with pride. Giselle squeezed his arm. The room rewarded him for sounding certain. Meanwhile, all I could think about was one simple fact. The most dangerous mistake in engineering isn't ignorance. It's believing you've already checked everything. And judging by the confidence sitting across from me, Von Beck had stopped checking a long time ago. The applause around Vaughn faded into smaller conversations. People returned to their drinks, their phones, their investments, their own voices. The room had already decided who the winner was. That was the funny thing about confidence. Most people mistake it for competence. I picked up the yellow drafting paper again. Nobody paid attention at first. Why would they? As far as everyone knew, I was still examining a blank sheet of paper that had already provided the evening's entertainment. The chandelier above us threw hard white light across the room. Thousands of crystal pieces reflected it in every direction. Abram would have appreciated the irony. The answer had been hanging above everyone's head the entire time. I lifted the paper slowly. A few guests glanced over, mostly out of curiosity, not concern. The sheet rose into the light, and suddenly the room changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, just enough. The fibers inside the paper began revealing details invisible from the table: lines, patterns, pressure marks, geometric structures. The faint outline of a federal registration seal. My eyes followed the design. Then the larger framework appeared, a maritime grid, detailed, official, extremely official. The same type of documentation I'd reviewed countless times while coordinating port reconstruction projects. For a second, I almost laughed. Not because it was surprising, because it was exactly what Abram would have done. The old man never trusted safes, never trusted passwords, never trusted obvious solutions. He trusted patience. I lowered the paper. Several people had noticed now. One investor leaned forward. "What is that?" Another stood slightly from his chair. My mother frowned. "What are you looking at?" I placed the paper back onto the table, carefully. The same way Abram handled important documents. Then I looked directly at Vaughn. His smile was still there, barely. You bought the dirt, Vaughn. The table beside us stopped talking, not because I raised my voice. I didn't. Because my tone changed. The room heard it. Everyone did. You bought the dirt, I repeated, but you didn't buy the water. Silence. Complete silence. The kind that arrives before people understand why they're uncomfortable. Vaughn blinked once. The smile disappeared. What? My mother looked confused. What is she talking about? I turned toward Vaughn. The property Abram left behind wasn't valuable because of the land. A few investors exchanged looks. Nobody interrupted. Good, I continued. Abram Finch owned the federal deepwater access patent for this entire section of coastline. The words landed heavily, not because everyone understood them, because they sounded expensive. Real money always sounds boring. That's how you know it's real. Vaughn set his bourbon glass down, slowly. You don't know what you're talking about. I ignored him. The 40 acres you purchased contain a designated industrial runoff zone. One investor frowned immediately. Another sat up straighter. Now I had their attention. Not because of maritime rights, because of liability. Investors understand liability. You cannot legally build residential condominiums on contaminated industrial runoff property without federal remediation approval. The room remained completely silent. I continued. The environmental review alone could take years. Someone near the end of the table whispered something under his breath. I caught one word, years. Exactly. Vaughn laughed. Too quickly, too loudly. A defensive laugh. We already did due diligence, did you? His jaw tightened. Not much, enough. I reached toward the paper, tapped the watermark. The Federal Maritime Grid references a commercial shipping corridor. No response. Bad sign. For him. Good sign. It meant he didn't know where this conversation was going. The land isn't the asset. Another pause. The access is. Across the table, Giselle looked completely lost. What access? Nobody answered her. Everyone was looking at Vaughn now. Including my mother. That was new. For most of the evening, Loretta had looked at him the way people look at lottery tickets. Now, she looked uncertain, very uncertain. Vaughn finally leaned forward. What exactly are you claiming? Claiming. Interesting choice of word. As if engineering records were opinions. I folded the paper again. Nothing. The room waited. I'm not claiming anything. I pointed toward the watermark. The federal registration is. A man sitting 2 chairs away from Vaughn suddenly pulled out his phone. Probably an investor. Probably searching. Smart move. 30 seconds later, his expression changed. Also a smart move. Because he had just found something, I didn't need to see the screen. His face told the story. The first crack had appeared. Vaughn noticed it too. What's wrong? The investor hesitated. That hesitation was worth more than any answer. My mother looked increasingly nervous. Loretta, one guest said carefully, did anyone commission an environmental assessment before the sale? My mother stared blankly. She had no idea what that meant. Of course she didn't. She thought property value came from waterfront views and glossy brochures. Abram spent his life studying shipping infrastructure. Those are not the same thing. I looked back toward Vaughn. For the first time all evening, he wasn't smiling. Not even pretending. Good. Now we were finally discussing the property itself instead of the fantasy attached to it. The old engineer had anticipated every step. The land, the buyers, the greed, the shortcuts, the assumptions, even the timing, especially the timing. Because Abram understood something most developers never learn. The biggest financial disasters don't happen when information is hidden. They happen when information is ignored. The room remained completely still. No laughter, no jokes, no champagne toasts. Just silence, and, sitting there beneath the chandelier, watching realization slowly move from one face to another, I found myself appreciating the elegance of Abram's design. He hadn't hidden the truth. He had simply left it where arrogant people would never bother looking. I watched the silence spread across the room, not the awkward silence from earlier, not the kind that follows a bad joke. This was different. This was the sound people make when expensive assumptions begin falling apart. Nobody touched their drinks. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody laughed. The investor who had searched the maritime registration was still staring at his screen. Vaughn noticed. His eyes locked onto the man's face, then onto mine, then back to the screen. Something inside him finally started doing the math. That's impossible. The confidence was gone, completely. The title search. The title search showed the land. I tapped the iron key once against the table. Clink. The sound seemed louder than it should have. It showed 40 acres of property. Another tap. It showed warehouse structures. Tap. It showed dock infrastructure. I looked directly at him. It did not show what was severed from the property 30 years ago. Several investors exchanged. One of them frowned. Another leaned forward. Nobody interrupted. Good. Because now they were listening. The maritime rights were separated from the land and transferred into a federal holding corporation. The investor with the phone lowered it slowly. Apparently, he had found enough information to stop searching. A corporation, I continued, that currently manages active shipping access agreements and government logistics contracts. The room remained completely silent. I named the figure. $42 million in change. No reaction, at first. Then came the collective shift, tiny movements. Straightened backs, raised eyebrows. Suddenly everyone understood that this wasn't a discussion about old docks anymore. This was a discussion about money. Real money. The kind sit inside infrastructure agreements nobody bothers reading. Vaughn's face had lost all color. His glass sat untouched beside him. The bourbon might as well have been water. That's not possible. The statement sounded weaker this time. I picked up the key, held it between two fingers. The metal looked ordinary. That's what made it beautiful. Abram always preferred ordinary things. Ordinary things get ignored. This isn't a house key. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. It's the access key for the Port Authority's master lockbox. A woman near the center of the table whispered, "What lockbox?" I answered without looking away from Vaughn. "The escrow vault." More silence. The bearer shares of the holding corporation have been stored there for decades. A city councilman blinked twice. One investor muttered something I couldn't hear. Another removed his glasses, then put them back on. Apparently hoping reality would improve on the second attempt. It didn't. I set the key beside the folded paper. Abram's final lesson sitting side by side, the answer, and the map. Abram left the contaminated property to the buyers. Nobody missed the word contaminated, especially not the investors. He left the corporation to me. The sentence landed hard. Not because I emphasized it, because I didn't. Across the table, Giselle grabbed Vaughn's arm. What does that mean? For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely frightened. Not embarrassed, not annoyed, frightened. Vaughn didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the paper, then the key, then the investors, then back to me. The sequence repeated twice. Man, reviewing a disaster, trying to locate an exit, finding none. What does that mean? Giselle repeated. Still no answer. One of the investors finally spoke. His voice sounded much colder than before. Vaughn. Nobody liked his tone, not even a little. When exactly did your environmental review come back? Vaughn swallowed. Bad sign. When did the review come back, Vaughn? Another investor asked. A different voice, same tone. The room had changed sides. I had seen this happen before, usually on construction projects. The moment a team realizes the forecast was wrong. The moment confidence stops protecting people. The moment accountability arrives. Vaughn opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing. That told everyone everything. My mother looked from face to face, confused. Lost. Still trying to understand how her perfect evening had wandered into a language she didn't speak. Environmental reviews, maritime patents, holding corporations, escrow vaults. These weren't country club subjects. These were infrastructure subjects. Abram's world, my world, not hers. Then realization finally arrived. Slowly, painfully, I watched it happen. Loretta looked at the investors, then at Vaughn, then at the key, then at me, and suddenly she understood. Not all of it, enough. Enough to recognize which side of the table held the actual asset. Her mouth opened slightly, closed, opened again, no words. Just calculation, years of calculation, the same calculation she'd made her entire life. Who has value, who doesn't? Who matters, who doesn't? For the first time in 34 years, the answer wasn't giving her the result she wanted. Her hand moved across the table, toward mine, slowly, carefully, the way people approach frightened animals or winning lottery tickets. Wren. Her voice had changed, completely. The performance returned. Only this time it was desperation wearing the costume. Honey. I almost laughed. She hadn't called me honey in years. Not sincerely, not even close. We're family. There it was. The emergency version of family, the one activated only when money appeared. We can work this out. I said nothing. She leaned forward. We can merge the deals. The investors looked away. A few seemed embarrassed for her. Others looked fascinated. Nobody came to her rescue. Not tonight. We can share the access rights. Her voice trembled, not from emotion, from fear. Fear of what she had lost, fear of what she had sold, fear of realizing she had spent the entire evening celebrating ownership of the wrong thing. I looked at her hand resting on the table, then at Vaughn, then at Giselle, then at the key. And sitting there in the absolute silence Abram Finch had engineered years before he died, I realized the old man hadn't built a trap for greedy people. He had built a mirror. And for the first time in their lives, my family was being forced to look directly into it. I looked at my mother's hand resting on the table, still reaching toward me, still waiting. For a second, nobody moved. Not Vaughn, not Giselle, not the investors, not the politicians. The entire room seemed frozen inside the moment. A few hours earlier, my mother had handed me an envelope like it was a practical joke. Now she was looking at that same envelope like it contained oxygen. Funny how value changes when people finally understand it. Ren. Her voice cracked slightly. We can figure this out. I said nothing. She tried again. Honey, we're family. The word landed between us. Family. The same word she had used in speeches. The same word she had used while laughing. The same word she had forgotten whenever I didn't fit the image she preferred. I wasn't angry. That surprised me a little. Standing there, looking at her, I realized something. The evening had already given me everything I needed. No apology would change the past. No argument would improve the lesson. No victory speech would make me feel better. The silence had already done all the work. I looked at my mother's outstretched hand. Then I looked at the empty champagne glasses scattered around the table, the expensive jewelry, the designer suits, the people who had spent hours measuring value using the wrong ruler. Finally, I spoke. You laughed at an empty envelope, Mom. Nobody breathed. Nobody interrupted. The entire room listened. Because you've spent your whole life judging the packaging without understanding the contents. My mother lowered her eyes. Not all the way. Just enough, I continued. You know how to sell things. The sentence hung there. You never bothered to learn how to build them. Silence. Absolute silence. Across the table, one investor slowly looked away. Another stared into his drink. Even the people who barely knew our family understood exactly what had happened. This was never about money. The money simply revealed the truth. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. For once, she didn't have a prepared speech. No performance, no script, just consequences. I picked up the folded drafting paper, then the iron key. Simple movements, nothing dramatic. The kind of movements people make when they already know where they're going. Giselle finally spoke. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Ren. I looked at her. She wasn't staring at the key anymore. She was staring at me. Not the military officer, not the sister she used to tease. Me. The actual person. Unfortunately, it had taken a financial disaster to make that happen. What happens now? She asked. Good question. A real question. Not a joke, not a performance, not an insult disguised as humor. For a moment, I almost answered. Then I realized the answer didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. For the first time all evening, that felt completely normal. I slipped the paper into the inside pocket of my dress uniform. The key followed. The metal settled against the fabric with a dull weight. Abram would have appreciated that. He always said important things should feel heavy, not because of what they weigh, because of what they carry. I pushed my chair back. The sound echoed through the room. Nobody tried to stop me, not immediately. I stood, straightened my jacket, adjusted the pocket, holding the key. Across the room, several investors were already having very different conversations than they had been having an hour earlier. Reality tends to change meeting agendas. Vaughn still hadn't moved. His face looked pale, exhausted, like a man reviewing damage reports after a hurricane. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. Then I remembered how eagerly he had laughed. How eagerly he had mocked Abram. How eagerly he had assumed understanding was unnecessary. The feeling passed. People are allowed to make mistakes. The problem begins when arrogance turns mistakes into strategy. I started toward the exit. No dramatic speech. No final confrontation. No demand for apologies. The truth didn't need additional help. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name one last time. Ren. I stopped. Not because she asked, because I wanted to. I looked back. The room looked completely different now. Same people, same tables, same chandeliers, different reality. My mother sat frozen in her chair. Giselle looked lost. Vaughn looked defeated. The investors looked busy calculating. Everyone was finally paying attention to the right things. I gave a small nod. Then I walked away. The cold night air hit my face the instant I stepped outside. Much better. The harbor stretched into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Cargo lights blinked in the distance. Real work. Real movement. Real value. A 40-minute drive later, I found myself standing where I should have been all along. Abrams Shipyard. The old docks creaked softly beneath the wind. Rust-covered sections of steel. Several warehouse walls needed repair. A few pilings would eventually need replacement. Most people saw decay. Engineers see maintenance schedules. I walked to the edge of the dock and stopped. Salt air, iron, water. The same smells that had greeted me at the country club. Only here they were honest. No perfume, no speeches, no pretending. I slipped my hands into my pockets and looked across the dark water. Somewhere beyond the harbor, ships were moving cargo. Contracts were being fulfilled. Supply chains were operating. The empire Abram had protected was already working. It had never needed applause. That was the final lesson. Your worth does not increase when other people finally recognize it. Their recognition changes. Your worth doesn't. Too many people spend their lives trying to convince others to see what they're holding. Abram never did. And neither would I. The people determined to misunderstand you will eventually create their own consequences. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to fight them. You don't need to prove anything. You simply need to know what you're holding in your hands. Then keep building. The wind rolled across the water. The docks remained exactly where they had always been. And for the first time that entire evening, everything felt perfectly quiet. The wind stayed with me long after that night. A few weeks later, I found myself walking through Abram's old workshop again. Nothing had changed. The same steel shelves stood against the walls. The same workbench sat beneath the windows. The same coffee-stained notebooks were stacked exactly where he'd left them. Most people would have seen an old building full of outdated equipment. I saw 20 years of lessons. For a long time, I thought Abram had been teaching me engineering, and he had. He taught me how to inspect dock structures, how to read title reports, how to analyze load calculations, how to identify problems before they became disasters. Those lessons built my career. But standing there alone that morning, I realized they weren't the most important things he had given me. The real lesson had taken me years to understand. Abram taught me how to recognize value, not market value, not resale value, real value. There's a difference. I remember one afternoon when I was about 16. Abram handed me a rust-covered metal box he had pulled from a storage shelf. "What's it worth?" he asked. I looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. "Nothing." He nodded. Then he handed me a screwdriver. "Try again." Inside that rusted box were original navigation records from a shipping company that no longer existed. Collectors would have paid thousands for them. The box looked worthless. The contents weren't. That happened over and over again. He would point at some ugly piece of equipment sitting in a corner and ask me what I saw. At first, I only saw appearances. Later, I learned to look deeper. That lesson followed me everywhere. Into the army, onto construction sites, into boardrooms, into relationships, and eventually into that country club dining room. The truth is, my family didn't fail because they were bad people. They failed because they made the same mistake most people make. They judged everything too quickly. The envelope looked worthless, so they stopped looking. The shipyard looked old, so they stopped asking questions. I looked different from the people they admired, so they stopped trying to understand me. The pattern was exactly the same, and if we're being honest, most of us have done that at some point. We've all looked at someone and decided who they were before learning their story. We've all mistaken appearance for substance. We've all confused visibility with value. Modern life encourages it. Social media encourages it. Advertising encourages it. Everything around us tells us to make decisions fast. Swipe left, swipe right, hire this person, ignore that person, trust this expert, dismiss that one. The faster we judge, the more efficient we feel. The problem is that some of the most valuable things in life require patience. Some of the strongest people don't look impressive at first. Some of the smartest people don't advertise it. Some of the best opportunities arrive disguised as work. And some of the most important relationships begin with people who don't fit the image we had in our heads. I learned that lesson while rebuilding ports overseas. The person with the most useful answer was rarely the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it was the quiet technician. Sometimes it was the maintenance supervisor. Sometimes it was the worker nobody bothered to ask. The people who paid attention usually succeeded. The people who relied on assumptions usually created expensive problems. The same principle applies outside construction sites. I've seen people overlook good employees because they weren't charismatic. I've seen people walk away from great friendships because first impressions weren't exciting enough. I've seen parents spend years misunderstanding their own children because those children didn't match their expectations. That one hits close to home. The older I get, the more I realize that wisdom isn't about knowing more facts than everyone else. Wisdom is learning where to look. Anybody can notice what's obvious. Anybody can admire what's shiny. Anybody can chase what's popular. The harder skill is recognizing value before everyone else sees it. Abram understood that. That's why he wasn't impressed by expensive things. He was impressed by useful things, competent people, reliable systems, strong foundations. The things that keep working long after attention moves somewhere else. Looking back now, I don't think Abram left me an empire because I was smarter than my family. I think he left it to me because he knew I would actually see it. That's a very different thing. The world is full of opportunities hidden inside ordinary packaging. The world is full of good people hiding behind awkward introductions. The world is full of lessons disguised as disappointments. Most people miss them because they stop looking too soon. Abram never did, and after everything that happened, neither do I. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my story, it's this. Don't let appearances make decisions for you. Take the extra minute, ask the extra question, look a little deeper. Because sometimes the most valuable thing in the room is the thing everyone else is laughing at. That lesson stayed with me long after the paperwork was settled, long after the lawyers finished their meetings, long after the investors stopped calling. What surprised me most wasn't that Vaughn lost money. People lose money every day. What surprised me was how completely avoidable the whole thing had been. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Vaughn's real problem wasn't greed, and it wasn't intelligence. The man wasn't stupid. In fact, he was probably smarter than most people in that room. His problem was something far more dangerous. He believed he already knew enough. That's a trap I've seen destroy careers, businesses, marriages, and entire organizations. Once people convince themselves they already have all the answers, they stop asking questions. The moment that happens, blind spots start multiplying. One of the first things I learned in the Army Corps of Engineers is that confidence is not evidence. I've sat in meetings where highly educated experts were absolutely certain about a forecast. 6 months later, reality proved them wrong. I've watched multi-million-dollar projects get delayed because somebody assumed a report had already been reviewed. I've seen construction schedules collapse because one person was too proud to ask a simple question. The pattern is always the same. The mistake isn't what they don't know. The mistake is believing they already know it. I remember a port reconstruction project overseas where a contractor insisted a foundation system would perform perfectly. He had years of experience. He had impressive credentials. He had charts, reports, and presentations. He also had certainty. A dangerous amount of certainty. One junior engineer raised concerns during a planning meeting. Nothing dramatic, just a few questions. The contractors dismissed him immediately. Too young, too inexperienced, too cautious. 3 months later, the issue that engineer identified became the single most expensive delay on the entire project. The contractor didn't fail because he lacked knowledge. He failed because he stopped listening. That's what happened to Vaughn. The warning signs were everywhere. Abram never sold the property. The maritime records existed, the environmental restrictions existed, the easements existed, the corporate structure existed. None of those things were hidden. They simply required effort. And effort becomes inconvenient when someone is already convinced they're right. If you're watching this, I want you to think about how often that happens in everyday life, not just in business. Everywhere. People assume they understand their spouse's intentions without asking questions. People assume they understand their children's struggles without listening. People assume they understand coworkers, neighbors, friends, and family members based on incomplete information. Then they make decisions based on those assumptions. Sometimes the consequences are small. Sometimes they're life-changing. One of the most useful habits I've ever developed is learning to pause before certainty arrives. Whenever I hear myself thinking, I already know what's going on, I force myself to stop. Because that's usually the moment when I'm most likely to miss something important. The smartest engineers I know are not the ones who always have answers. They're the ones who keep asking questions after everyone else stops. They're curious. They're skeptical. They're willing to look foolish for a few minutes if it helps them avoid being wrong for a few years. That's a trade I'll take every time. The same principle applies outside work. Before you invest money, ask another question. Before you quit your job, ask another question. Before you end a friendship, ask another question. Before you assume someone's motives, ask another question. The older I get, the more convinced I become that humility is one of the most practical skills a person can develop. Not because it's morally superior, because it's useful. Humility keeps your eyes open. Humility keeps you learning. Humility gives you access to information that arrogance automatically rejects. And information changes outcomes. Vaughn spent millions of dollars because he assumed ownership of land automatically meant ownership of opportunity. He never stopped long enough to verify that assumption. The result wasn't bad luck. It wasn't fate. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was simply the bill arriving for a decision that wasn't fully understood. Life sends those bills eventually. To all of us. I've received a few myself. Everybody does. The goal isn't to become perfect. The goal is to remain teachable. That's why I still carry one of Abram's old notebooks in my office. Not because I need the engineering notes anymore. Most of those systems are outdated now. I keep it because of something written inside the front cover. 5 words. Nothing complicated. Nothing profound. Just 5 words. Check again before you assume. That's it. No grand philosophy. No motivational speech. Just a reminder. And honestly, it might be the most valuable lesson I learned from him. Because the most expensive mistakes in life usually don't come from what we don't know. They come from what we're absolutely certain we already know. And the day we stop questioning ourselves is often the day we start creating problems we can't yet see. I still visit the shipyard a few times every year, not because I need to, because it reminds me of something important. The docks are in much better shape now than they were the night I stood there after leaving the country club. Several structures have been repaired. New contracts have come and gone. New crews have arrived. Old equipment has been replaced. Time did what time always does. It kept moving. The funny thing is that when people hear my story, they usually focus on the wrong part. They focus on the money. They focus on the corporation. They focus on the contracts. They focus on the moment Vaughn realized he had made a terrible mistake. I understand why. Those moments are dramatic, but they aren't the reason the story matters. If you take away the contracts, the key, the company, and every dollar connected to them, the most important lesson stays exactly the same. The real victory happened long before I opened that envelope. It happened the day I stopped trying to earn approval from people who had already decided not to understand me. That was the turning point. And if I'm being honest, it took me years to get there. A lot of people spend their lives chasing validation. Some chase it from parents. Some chase it from spouses. Some chase it from coworkers. Some chase it from people they barely know. They're constantly trying to prove something, trying to be enough, trying to finally earn the respect they think will make everything feel complete. I understand that feeling. I've lived it. For years, part of me wanted my mother to look at me the way she looked at Giselle. I wanted her to understand why I chose my career. I wanted her to appreciate the work I was doing. I wanted her to see value where I saw value. The problem was that I was asking someone to use a measuring system she had never learned. She measured status. I measured substance. Those are not the same thing. And sooner or later, you have to accept that some people are never going to evaluate you fairly. Not because you're failing. Because they're looking for something entirely different. That's a difficult lesson. But it's also an incredibly freeing one. The moment you stop building your life around someone else's approval, you gain an enormous amount of energy. Energy you can invest somewhere useful. Into your skills, into your work, into your family, into your health, into your future. Into the things that actually matter. One of the best pieces of advice I can give anyone watching this is simple. Invest in competence before you invest in image. The world spends a lot of time teaching people how to look successful. Very little time teaching people how to become successful. Learn the skill, do the work, build the foundation. The recognition can arrive later or not. Either way, you'll still have the skill. That's what Abram understood. That's what the shipyard represented. Everything valuable there existed because someone built it, not because someone advertised it. The same principle applies to your life. Build character, build discipline, build knowledge, build relationships that are based on trust instead of convenience, build habits that still work when nobody is watching. Those things compound over time, much faster than appearances do. I've also learned something else over the years. Not everyone who misunderstands you deserves an explanation. That doesn't mean becoming bitter. It doesn't mean cutting everyone off. It simply means recognizing that your time is valuable. You don't need to spend every day defending your choices to people committed to misunderstanding them. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to correct every opinion. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is keep building, quietly, consistently, patiently. Let results speak when they're ready. The people who genuinely care about you will eventually understand. The people who don't probably won't, and that's okay. The older I get, the more convinced I become that dignity comes from clarity. Knowing who you are, knowing what matters to you, knowing what you're building, and refusing to hand those decisions to other people. That's the lesson I carried away from Abram. That's the lesson I carried away from that dinner. And that's the lesson I hope you carry away from this story. Know your worth. Keep learning, keep building, and don't let people who only understand packaging convince you that the contents don't matter. Thank you for spending this time with me and staying all the way to the end of the story. If stories like this resonate with you, stories about family, dignity, resilience, personal growth, and lessons you can actually apply to real life, I'd love for you to be part of this community. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us every day for more unforgettable stories and meaningful life lessons. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep building your future, and never forget the value of what's in your hands.